I'm Warwick Sabin, Executive Director of the Society of Fellows, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this SOF digital discussion. I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe, and I want to thank you for being a part of the Society of Fellows. Your membership directly supports and sustains the work of the Aspen Institute, and that support and that work is more critical now than ever before. And I want to acknowledge that we're coming together at a particularly challenging time for our nation. And therefore, we're fortunate to have Professors Stephen Carter and Melissa Murray in conversation with us today. Stephen is a trustee of the Aspen Institute and is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Law at Yale Law School, where he's been a member of the faculty since 1982. He's the author of 15 books and 6 novels, and currently writes regularly for Bloomberg. He also served as a law clerk for U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. Melissa is the Frederick I and Grace Stokes Professor of Law at NYU School of Law. And before that, she was the interim dean of the law school at the University of California at Berkeley. She is a legal contributor for ABC News and is a co-host of Strict Scrutiny, a podcast about the Supreme Court and the legal culture that surrounds it. And she clerked for current U.S. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor when she was serving on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. As with all of our SOF digital discussions, Stephen and Melissa will be glad to answer your questions after the initial conversation, and you could submit your questions anytime by simply clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and typing them in. And if you encounter any problems during the event, please email the SOF hotline and our team will be glad to assist you. So Stephen and Melissa are going to chat for the first 20 or 30 minutes, and then I will pose your questions to them for the rest of the event. So now I'll turn the floor over to Melissa.
Thank you, Warwick. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. As Warwick said, these are unprecedented times. I will say as a personal note, it's unprecedented for me because I have never really had the opportunity to interrogate one of my former law professors before. So I will just say that 20 years ago, when I was a first-year law student at Yale, the very first question I got in law school came from none other than Stephen Carter. So I'm absolutely delighted to be able to turn the tables today and ask him some questions about what's facing our country right now. So let me start with this general premise. Our Constitution tries to strike a balance between a desire for national security and a strong centralized government that's prepared to respond to exigent threats with the desire to foster personal liberty and autonomy among its citizens. To do that, it protects certain individual rights from interference with the government. It also provides for a division of authority between the federal government and the states, and then with the people. But all of that is suspended in some cases when we have situations that go beyond ordinary circumstances. Wartime threats, emergencies, a global pandemic, all of these might be seen to be part of that set of extraordinary circumstances that require the Constitution perhaps to rethink that balance of power between government and the people. And so who better to talk about how we strike that balance in times of exigency than Stephen Carter, who has written so eloquently about all of these things. And so I want to go to one of your books, Professor Carter. So back in 2013, in the summer of 2013, I read your impeachment of Abraham Lincoln. So it is a fictional account of an event that did not happen. Abraham Lincoln was never impeached, but you imagine that he was impeached and you make a convincing case that much of the work that he did as a wartime president at the close of the Civil War and throughout the Civil War actually might have crossed the line and exceeded executive authority and would have been grounds for impeachment. And so you write an entire book imagining what the defense of Lincoln would have looked like and what that impeachment would have looked like. With that in mind, given that our current president, President Trump, has likened the current situation to being at war, that the coronavirus and everything that's followed in its wake is like being a wartime president, what's the proper balance for an executive like President Trump to strike as he tries to deal with these exigent circumstances, but also tries to stay within the scope of executive authority?
Well, Melissa, that's a great question. Before I answer, let me say that I'm feeling very old today because not only am I answering questions from a former student who I think many of us knew from the first time she opened her mouth in school was fated for great things, but also she was a law clerk for my law school classmate and dear friend, Sonia Sotomayor. So I feel that I'm the old man in the room. It's also interesting that you start off asking about a work of fiction. After all, the Impeachment of Abraham Lincoln was a novel. But to answer the question, let me start with President Trump. So President Trump, as you said, has suggested that this is the moral equivalent of war, or that we're in a wartime situation. He said that with the pandemic. He's treated it as an emergency. He's also seems to be thinking that the uprising, the demonstrations following the horrific death of George Floyd in Minneapolis are also may constitute an emergency of some kind. And it is true the courts have traditionally upheld all sorts of emergency decrees by presidents, often, I would say, to the embarrassment years later of the courts. Before we get back to Trump now, Lincoln was an interesting case. Although my book is very critical of Lincoln in a lot of ways, I continue to believe that he is not only the best, but the most important American president. He largely defined the modern presidency, but he took a lot of emergency measures. He did suspend habeas corpus. Newspaper editors critical of the war were locked up. Correspondents at the front who issued dispatches that generals disagreed with were subject to courts martial. And to be subject to courts martial or locked up in those days meant thrown basically into a dungeon until the president or the secretary of state decided to let you out. So it's not as though he didn't do a lot of things that I hope would not be the model of what we would do today. I don't deny that there are moments when constitutional values have to be balanced against, I wouldn't say yield to, balanced against moments of emergency. But I don't want the judgment of whether an emergency exists to rest simply on, well, the president says it exists, or a governor says it exists, or a mayor says it exists. Quite apart from the Constitution, liberal theory is built in large part on the notion that when the government acts, it acts in ways that are comprehensible and explicable. That even if it has to act hastily, we can basically understand whether we're persuaded or not. And that's where the trouble tends to arise when emergencies take the form where it's really hard to understand. One of the reasons that I think the news media have so much fun, in a fun and a dark sense, with looking at various emergency decrees in different states and saying, well, this one allows golf and this one does, and this one allows boats, but not barbers, and so on, or whatever it might be. All of them making fun, and they're being a little unfair because governing is hard. But on the other hand, they are, whether they are not getting at that point, that law ought to be consistent and coherent and explicable. And too often when people begin talking about emergency, it isn't.
So that's a great point. The law should be explicable. It should be predictable to some degree, but that's the very essence of an emergency. Nothing is predictable. Nothing is easily explained. And you have to sort of respond to exigencies that you may not even fully understand in full. And that's certainly been the case with this pandemic. With that in mind, how do we strike this balance? And how do we as a people interpret what the government is doing in these moments? Do you think the government has gone too far? There's a lot of discussion now about states taking these shelter-in-place orders and imposing them within their boundaries, and this has had a deleterious effect on the economies in those states. And the governors of those states say that it was necessary in order to deal with this public health crisis. You see that happening. There's a clash between the governors who are doing this and the president. And then layer on top of that, the domestic unrest that's resulted in the wake of George Floyd's killing. How do we think about all this? Is this the sort of emergency scenario that the Constitution's framers contemplated? Is this the kind of emergency that would warrant the exercise of some of those emergency powers that you contemplated when you were thinking about this project in this particular moment?
It's really striking that the Constitution doesn't talk about its own suspension in emergencies. This is a kind of common law invention by our practices. You know, Felix Frankfurter, remember, once said that the actual, like, I can't get the right quote anymore, I'm too old, that the measure of what the Constitution means isn't what the words say, but we actually do. And we do in practice. In practice, we tend to place a lot of faith in and give a lot of power to those who are empowered to declare emergencies. And maybe they're right when they do it, but they could also be wrong. And one of the things that has to happen in emergency, I think, is that it's precisely when the government is claimed to itself the greatest amount of power, which it does in emergency, that's most important to allow the rest of us to question, interrogate, and challenge that power. And so if you look at, say, World War II, there were a lot of emergency decrees. It wasn't just the Japanese exclusion, although that was probably the worst of it, but there were a lot of people held without trial. There were a lot of people sent to military rather than civil courts. There were a lot of other things that were done by the Roosevelt administration, and maybe they were defensible. But it strikes me that we ought to always be trying to discuss and argue and question. I mean, it's actually funny, you know, maybe not as my aunt would say, not ha-ha funny, but it's funny how quickly our discussions break down on partisan lines. That always scares me. I'm not, as those of you know my work, you know, I'm not much of a partisan myself. Politics I find a little boring. But I really, when issues break down along partisan lines, I always feel a kind of despair coming on. Let me give you a couple of examples of what I have in mind when I talk about emergency. Let's start again with President Trump and the question of the use of the Insurrection Act, which would allow the president to send troops to keep order. Now, it is true that the Constitution guarantees every state a Republican form of government. And Lincoln, as one of his legal justifications, some of the action he took in the Civil War, took the view that that means the president can send armed forces to places where the government has lost control. And Lincoln consistently viewed the rebellion not as an actual secession, but as the government losing effective control of various parts of the country. That was seen as an emergency. But I don't think one can easily make the case that demonstrations, however large, are an example of the government losing control. I don't, it's not as though Washington is being burned to the ground, which has actually happened in the past. I think that if the president were to say this is a national emergency that requires me to put troops in the streets, it would be perfectly reasonable for the rest of us to say, but I don't see the ground for the emergency. What is it that is so urgent this has to be done this particular way? And I think it's possible to question some of the decrees in the pandemic the same way. At least a lot of people have questioned them. And my view is, instead of saying to people who question whether 6 feet is, for example, strictly necessary, or whether we shouldn't wear masks and we're told not to get them, and then should wear them when we're told to get them, instead of treating people as, well, there's something wrong with you because you're challenging what public health officials say, seems to me that public health officials are simply government employees, just like the president is. And we have not only the right, but the responsibility to question them and challenge them all the time, especially when they're relying on emergency powers to do things pretty much by decree. This is not to say any particular rule that's been adopted in the pandemic is wrong. It's only to say that the challenging and interrogating of these rules is really, really important.
So the idea that in a democracy, the role that the people play is one of critique and in some cases dissent. And you actually need that for the democracy to continue thriving without tipping over into tyranny or authoritarianism. With that in mind, and moving from the president to the governors, for example, to keep it bipartisan or nonpartisan, if you will, many of the governors have been criticized for their efforts to lock down their states in order to keep the pandemic under control, to stave off the spread of the disease, and to maintain the public health system. Do you think that they are not only open to challenges, but do you think that they are likely liable from those who claim that these orders have actually impaired their opportunity to be economically viable? So a number of small business owners have filed suit in a number of states arguing that these shelter-in-place orders constitute regulatory takings, which means that the government would have to compensate them for the loss of property because of the official government action. Do you think those are viable claims?
I want to answer that question. Before I do, I want to say make one general point about the first half, as it were, of your question. It's important to remember that the decrees by governors have the force of law in their states, which means if you don't obey, you can be arrested. If you look at the data in places where we have data, people being arrested for violating these decrees are disproportionately people of color, Black people and Hispanic people in particular, are heavily being subject to arrest. I mention this because we know that every arrest of a person of color is a potential flashpoint where things can go terribly wrong, terribly fast. And the more points of arrest that are possible, the more these things are going to happen. I've mentioned in the past that that not every thing that's forbidden, it seems to me, is something that requires the use of force in order to resolve. We can get back to that. But you asked about the takings question. And the takings clause of the Constitution, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, requires just compensation when property is taken for private use. And the typical takings model is they come along and condemn your house to build a highway. And everybody understands if that happens, they got to pay you for the house. Now you might haggle over how much, and you might have to go to court to figure it out, but everyone understands they've got to pay you. The question becomes, what if they greatly reduce or even or destroy the value of what you're doing? And this is particularly true for businesses. And the courts over the years have basically held that if the destruction of value is very, very large, well, let me put it another way, the greater the destruction of value, the stronger your case for a taking. So if all that's happened is your profit has been somewhat trimmed by a regulation, that's not a taking. That's not a taking. The courts are very clear about that. But if the government says you can't operate at all, and that goes on for more than a short period of time, the courts have said that is a taking. The argument would be over how long a period of time it goes on. If I'm a small business owner, I certainly know a lot of small business owners, and I've been told I can't operate my business. Of course, this being America, my first instinct is going to be to sue. I don't know if these small business owners are going to win or not, but I think the longer that they're kept from opening, the stronger their case becomes. There actually was a point made in a concurring opinion in a Texas case just last month, that there comes a point at which, I should say, as each day passes, the government's burden of showing necessity rises, is the point. So the courts held, for example, that 48-hour regulatory taking, where you close the business entirely for some reason, no compensation. But as time passes, the greater the amount of time that passes, the stronger the government's ground has to be. So a ground that might justify closing everyone for a week doesn't necessarily justify closing everyone for 3 months. I think that's the way to think about these cases. At some point over in that period of time, you reach a point where, unless the necessity is absolute, unless there's no other way to accomplish the goal, which is likely to be disputed, it's true that the value of the business has been completely destroyed by the regulation. And at that point, we're not talking about a minor infringement on the ability to make a profit. We're talking about the loss of one's ability to make a living at all.
Well, with that in mind, though, what is the line? So we are in this moment, we don't really have a strong sense of how long this pandemic will go on, when we'll actually be in control of it. How long does this duration have to be to rise to the level of an unconstitutional taking such that compensation is required for small business owners?
Well, I don't imagine we'll ever have a total control of it. I can't imagine that would ever happen. It may burn itself out. A vaccine may be developed. A lot of things we can imagine, but I don't know there'll be a moment where we can say we've really got this thing. We've got our arms around it. So I think the question has to be, as we watch some places haltingly reopen, both here and overseas, what are their actual experiences? And that's the sort of thing that we want to be able to trust government officials to make good judgments about. And I think it's important that, to the extent possible, the courts defer to those judgments. But I don't know where the line is where we can finally say that, notwithstanding that judgment at this point, you have taken too much. I don't know where that line is, but I'm confident that it exists.
One of the areas where you've really written wonderful work is in the intersection of law and religion. And religious liberty, of course, is one of the principal liberties that the Constitution's framers wanted to protect when they were thinking about the structure of divided government. One of the big questions that has emerged in this pandemic is whether or not houses of worship are quote unquote essential services such that they can be exempt from these orders and can be allowed to continue operating. But of course, the whole process of worshiping brings a lot of people into close contact with one another. Sometimes they're singing and voluble exclamation, and that may actually provide aerosols that allow the coronavirus to spread. So with that in mind, how should we think about something as vital to our democracy as freedom of religion, while also this question of security, public health, and safety, and trying to balance those two concerns?
So in my writing about freedom of religion, one of the points that I've been emphasizing for decades now is that we shouldn't think of freedom of religion as just the freedom to believe whatever you want. Freedom of religion has a behavior aspect, and the most central part of that behavior, even the Supreme Court has said, is the act of worship, is coming together for corporate worship. That's at the heart of it. It's the heart of both what preserves a religion and projects into the future and what brings a certain reality to the worshipers themselves. And there are minor exceptions, nearly every religion we know has some form of corporate worship at some time, although for different schedules, different purposes for which people come together. It seems to me that at minimum what the Constitution requires is that the churches be allowed to operate on the same basis as other businesses. So for example, if other businesses being deemed essential are being allowed to open but have certain distancing rules, masking rules, cleanliness rules that are of general application, then it seems to me the house of worship should be able to open if they're able to take those same precautions. That is, to treat them like other things. If nobody can go out, period, zero people, then I think the churches are stuck with everyone else. Once you begin to make exceptions, the constitutional problem arises when those exceptions are different in different cases. And I know that the Supreme Court had a chance to decide this recently.
Just an order on, so a procedural issue, not an actual
procedural
decision.
issue, right. And part of the problem in that case, without going into too much detail to bore the audience, was that the local order that had kept the church from meeting was actually moot, because just before the court could hear the case, the order had been changed to allow the church a certain degree of freedom in its operation. So we don't know how the court would have ruled had the case been otherwise, but we do know that the municipality was worried enough to change the rule before the order was ruled on by the court. And there have been a number of local orders like that involving religion that, once they're challenged in court, have been altered. Now, but there is one thing I need to mention that you also brought up: singing. Singing does seem to be a very powerful means of transmission, as a couple of epidemiologists said in a paper. I think they're infectious disease people actually. Every bit as powerful as coughing was the way that they put it. So you imagine someone coughing on you constantly, then you're, say, in a choir or in a pew somewhere and standing next to someone who's singing. I think that can be a real problem. And I do think that it is reasonable for public health authorities to say, you can meet, but you have to have social distancing and you have to wear masks and you can't sing. You can't sing, at least for the duration you can't sing. There are people who will say, no, singing is crucial to my worship, and I understand and respect that. I think we should expand religious freedom as far as we possibly can, but it's easy here to see and understand why the public health authorities could draw the line at singing, at least at corporate singing, as opposed to maybe one person behind a screen, which apparently is being tried in some places, who will sing and you'll hear her voice through speakers, and meanwhile she's in a room by herself or something like that. But other than that, I do think that a restriction on singing actually most courts would find to be reasonable.
So can we go back to the Supreme Court's order in that case that you mentioned? It's true that the state had actually mooted the entire issue by changing the nature of the order and making the provisions more broadly applicable to a wider range of businesses in a neutral way. But Chief Justice John Roberts, in what some viewed as a quite surprising turn, actually joined the liberal wing of the court to form a majority in that opinion. And he wrote a short opinion in that order where he basically said that the nature of these situations was so dynamic and fast moving that the courts themselves really were not in a position to assess whether or not a state's efforts to deal with the pandemic were appropriate, and that deference from the judicial branch was actually necessary. The conservative wing of the court, led by Justice Kavanaugh, who wrote an opinion there, completely disagreed and would have allowed the church to reopen regardless of the mootness of the order, but felt that churches should be subject to the same kinds of restrictions as other quote unquote essential businesses. With that in mind, the idea that the judges don't necessarily have a full idea of what is going on, and the executive or the legislature may have more information that isn't publicly available, or at least to which the courts aren't privy. What is the role of the courts in intervening in an emergency, given that they may not know? And we can think about Korematsu versus United States, where the Roosevelt administration issued an executive order calling for the internment of the Japanese and those of Japanese descent all along the Pacific coast of the United States. The court, again, sort of deferred to those national security interests, saying that there were things that they likely did not understand or know about that situation, and it warranted deference to the executive and to Congress.
So John Roberts and I were law clerks together. He was clerking for Justice Rehnquist while I was clerking for Justice Marshall. We had a lot of fun back in there, but in this case, I think he's just wrong. He's just wrong. I think you could issue an opinion and stand by it that says, given that this is just up on the issue of a stay, we don't think it's ripe for adjudication. You can issue an opinion and say, I don't think the church should win because I think the rule should be this and this. But the notion that the court shouldn't get involved because the executives and others have more information, and I agree with you, actually, that's a perfectly reasonable way to read his opinion, is one that's been dangerous all through our history. It's almost always true that there's more information. In 1962, I believe, James J. Kilpatrick wrote a little book called The South's Case for School Segregation. And one of the arguments in the book was that the courts really can't understand the Southern mind and what people are thinking. And that even if these fears are at some level unreasonable, the courts don't understand them and are not adequately taking them into account. This is one of the arguments in the book. This is always an argument that's made. There's a kind of worrisome, to me, statism about it. I'm not saying, I'm not for judicial supremacy, that in the battle among the branches, the courts always win. But I do think the courts shirk their responsibility a little bit when they say the reason that we're not going to get into this is the issues are such that the executive or the governors are better able to make these judgments. That, for me, is where the danger arises.
One final question from me before we turn it over to the audience. You've said here, you've said elsewhere that Abraham Lincoln is probably the greatest president that we have ever had in this nation. And as you recount in your book, although it is a work of fiction, the things you actually chronicle are actual factual events that happened. He skirted the line more often than not in administering the Civil War. Like, there are lots of areas where the line between permissible executive authority and unconstitutional executive authority was pretty thin, and he walked it a lot of the time in conducting the war. With that in mind, is it the case that to be a truly great president, to really sort of take hold in difficult circumstances, you do actually have to skirt a thin line? You really do have to walk close to the edge. And if that's the case, do we have a constitutional order that's really set out for greatness?
That's a great question. Obviously, that's a book question. That's not, I'll give you the shortest answer I can without really knowing the full answer. In Lincoln's case, the one thing we can all agree on is that whatever he did, and some things he did I think were bad, but whatever he did, we did face a genuine emergency. There were states that actually were seceding. There were federal forts and weapons that had actually been taken. There were lives that had actually been lost. That was a genuine insurrection. It was a real emergency. As to whether the Constitution allows for greatness, I think that's a neat question in a way, but I'm reminded a little bit of, my colleague Bruce Ackerman's comment in a book published about 20 odd years ago, maybe 30 years ago now, I guess, that the American Constitution economizes on virtue. That is, that it's designed in a way, at least in Bruce's understanding of it, designed in a way where you keep the bad guys from getting away from things. So, I'm sorry, you keep the good guys from getting away from things, my apologies, to make sure the bad guys can't do them. We don't assume that that the government is going to be run by angels. We're all happier when it is, but they have to abide by the same rules as everybody else. But nevertheless, in Lincoln's case and in his defense, it was an extreme emergency, something not contemplated in any sense by the founders of the Constitution. And while in retrospect, there are things he did that I think were wrong, I also think that both early in his presidency, when he saw this as a war for the Union, and later in his presidency, when he refused to make peace on any ground that did not contemplate the abolition of slavery, he did the nation in both those ways an enormous service.
Excellent. So I'll turn it over to Warwick now to take questions from the audience. I know that there are already questions coming in the chat, so we're looking forward to them.
Terrific. Yes, and it's been a fantastic discussion. You've covered so much ground in such a short period of time, and we appreciate it. I want to remind everyone who's in the audience that if you'd like to submit a question, it's very simple. Just press the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type it in, and it will be my pleasure to read it aloud. I do want to take a point of personal privilege, though, and ask both of you, since we had a United States Senator recently write an op-ed for the New York Times, in essence, sort of advocating the use of the 1807 Insurrection Act to control the streets of America's cities, and even made a comparison to, that kind of use of force during the Civil Rights Movement in Mississippi, in Los Angeles during the Rodney King riots. As legal scholars, that argument coming from a United States Senator at this time, was it justified? Is there credence to it? How would you analyze that?
Well, why don't you go first, Melissa? I think we're going to agree on this.
I don't know, maybe we won't. Well, I should say first, in that op-ed by Tom Cotton, I mean, it is, I think, a true statement of the Insurrection Act to say that there are circumstances that would allow the president to take extraordinary measures to allow federal troops to go into a state to quell domestic unrest. But to even get to the Insurrection Act, I mean, there are a lot of precursors that you have to go through. As an initial matter, the law actually requires first an order from the president for the dissenters to disperse, and that obviously hasn't happened here. The references to desegregation and to other situations that have warranted the invocation of the Insurrection Act, I think, are markedly different from what we're seeing here. So in the context of desegregation, when federal troops were dispatched to the South to integrate the schools, you actually had state officials actively ignoring and defying federal law. It's not obvious that we have the same kind of outward defiance that's going on here. I mean, we have protests, and in many cases, the protests are within the scope of legitimate dissent that you're allowed to have under the Constitution. So I don't think that the two scenarios are necessarily the same, and that the Insurrection Act is invoked in the same way here, and that it's properly invoked. It's also worth noting that the Insurrection Act is meant to be an extraordinary departure. So ordinarily, the default is that state governors and the states themselves are authorized and prepared to deal with whatever domestic situations occur within their boundaries using their own law enforcement means. And the idea of federal troops going into a state in order to quell domestic unrest was something that I think the Constitution's framers would have found to be, quite unprecedented and deeply, deeply problematic.
Well, Melissa's being very kind to the op-ed, even in describing it that seriously. I wrote a book, as some of you know, 20 odd years ago, called Civility, Manners, Morals, and the Etiquette of Democracy. And so I try to be very measured in what I say about these things. But I thought the op-ed was silly. I really did. I'm not saying you can't make an argument. You can make arguments about almost anything, and they can be serious arguments. I didn't think it made a serious argument. And I mean, it's not contrary to what some members of the Times staff thought. I didn't think it was a firing offense to publish it. but I thought it was not a serious argument. Having said that, I should add, Lincoln followed the Insurrection Act. Lincoln actually he made a public decree to those who had led these secession movements to lay down their arms. And I think he said, and return to their place of abode, was the way that he put it. Otherwise, he would be forced to call out the troops, the militia of the several states, in order to quell disturbance. There's an analytical problem. I agree with Melissa. There's an analytical problem with the op-ed, in the sense that it doesn't sufficiently make a case that we face actual insurrection where local authorities have lost control. The case just isn't made. Moreover, if you look around, has there been violence? Yes. Is there always violence at the edge of demonstrations? People are angry? Of course there is. But the fact that and I'm not endorsing violence at all. I'm against it. I'm happy to condemn it. But the fact that some violence occurs at the edges of a demonstration, which is a fact of everyday life, of everyday demonstration life, doesn't mean that it's insurrection. Doesn't mean local authorities have lost control. And in every place where that's happened, they've gradually gained control. If you had whole cities burning, as I mentioned before, and local governors and mayors had no way of controlling what was going on, you might have a case. But there's nothing like that, remotely like that, that's occurred.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to a question from one of our members, John H. He's asking, the Constitution says that all men are created equal, but the reality is that statement never applied to all people. And today, many systems in this country, from education to policing to many others, benefit some people more than others. Do you think that systemic change to address the unequal treatment of people in this country should begin on a constitutional level?
Are you directing the question to a particular one of us, or how should we handle that?
Well, because I think you both are eminently qualified to answer it, so it's really up to the two of you how you want to go about it.
Well, I'll let Melissa take that first, although I'm happy to weigh in.
So we have had situations where constitutional change has been a method of dealing with systemic inequality. So Reconstruction is the obvious example where the Reconstruction amendments were meant to renegotiate the nature of the relationship between the states and the federal government, and also between the states and the people following the Civil War. So that is one example where, in fact, we have actually relied on constitutional change to make changes within our society. Now, note, we're still having this conversation. So obviously there are some limits to what the Constitution can do. And part of the failings, I think, or at least the initial failings of the Reconstruction amendments, had to do with a recalcitrant court that interpreted them very narrowly and did so in a way that limited the work that Congress wanted to do in enforcing the terms of the Reconstruction amendments. But I think we ought to think more broadly about what sustainable change might look like in our society and in our government. It's not just the Constitution. Most of the amendments have enabling acts, for example, and Congress could do more. I mean, part of this, of course, and the reticence, I think, of Congress to do things is that they are hopelessly fractured right now. We've never been more divided than we are in this moment, and it's hard to see legislative change as a method going forward. Except for the Civil War. But again, there are other avenues where we could think about this. So, to the point about systemic change within the criminal justice system, there is a bill that's been introduced that would do such things as eliminate qualified immunity, which is a judge-made doctrine that has made it really impossible to hold the police personally accountable for misconduct. That's proceeding through the various houses of Congress, and that's one way that you can have important changes. You don't have to just rely solely on the Constitution, and you don't have to solely rely on the federal Constitution. So the states are often more generative places to think about how to have lasting change that will really make a difference in the lives of individuals.
I basically agree with that, so I won't restate it, but I want to say a word about qualified immunity. If you've read my work, you know that I've been against qualified immunity for a long time. But I also think that simply stripping qualified immunity from police officers doesn't go far enough. Let's go back to Eric Garner, who was killed by police in New York in 2014. He was killed while allegedly resisting arrest, though it's clear he wasn't resisting. But what was the crime? The crime was selling loose, untaxed cigarettes, a crime that was almost never enforced, but was being enforced at that moment because political leaders, local New York political leaders, under pressure from local business leaders, wanted it enforced, wanted the crime enforced. Local small business leaders we're talking about. And so the qualified immunity question, it seems to me, shouldn't just encompass what police do at the point of enforcement. They're the most noticeable because they're the sharp spear of the law. And the more things you can arrest people for, the more often that's going to happen. I'm not saying we necessarily have to hold the political leaders or the police higher-ups liable, but it does seem to me that we have a real problem. In fact, if you want to know how big a problem we have, if you've ever been in a federal park and been caught in a rainstorm and sheltered under a rock or in a cave, you've probably broken the law, because disturbing the mud in a cave on federal land is a felony, not a misdemeanor. It's a felony. And you could, in theory, go to prison for it. There's lots and lots of places where this intersection of the police and the policed can come in. And by the way, there are other reforms as well. There is an economist who wrote a piece just this morning asking, why is it that armed police enforce traffic laws? A lot of countries, they don't. A lot of countries, it's done other ways. And his point was that if you look at the flashpoints that have resulted in the death of people of color, a lot of those begin as traffic stops. And if traffic stops didn't involve force, but involved rather an unarmed organization, he argued, we would be doing better. We'd have fewer opportunities for the flashpoints. Now, maybe that's right, maybe it's wrong, but it's an interesting idea. And I think this is the moment when we need interesting and fresh ideas. But again, I endorse wholeheartedly the restriction of qualified immunity.
Well, to that point, I mean, one thing that you could think about that would have an enormous impact immediately is just sort of rethinking what offenses are arrestable. So for example, George Floyd was arrested on a charge of forgery. There are lots of misdemeanor and low-level felony charges for which you might imagine, the person isn't a flight risk, the person isn't dangerous to the community. You could issue a summons and have that person appear in court and, be dealt with in that way. You don't necessarily have to deploy the police to arrest them. And again, when there is an arrest and force is used, the charge is often they were resisting arrest. So one way that you could eliminate the opportunity for that kind of intervention that turns violent is to limit the opportunities for contact to come through arrests.
I agree with that also. I know we're cutting into the time, but this is really important. This is a really interesting discussion. I agree with that also. And it's important to note that his charge of forgery is based on passing a counterfeit $20 bill. You can draw reasonable distinctions. You can say if somebody's trying to cash a $100,000 check, use different methods than if he's trying to pass a $20 bill.
Thank you. Yes, no, I mean, we need to do another conversation just strictly on policing and all the issues I think that are coming to the surface now in terms of, potential reforms and other issues surrounding that. But we are sort of dwindling in the time remaining. I'm going to get to one more question and it'll be a little bit off the subject we were just talking about. But Katie Quo-Gerson in Kansas City asks, do you predict the Senate will take up and pass the extension of the ERA state's qualification deadline?
Hi, Katie. It's great to see you again, if only virtually. Katie was in a seminar that I did with Ted Olson last year, and when we could all be together without masks. So it's nice to see you in this medium. I don't think the Senate is going to take it up. I think there are lots of questions about the constitutionality of the ERA because of the expiration of the 1983 deadline. And just generally the rescission from a number of states before that deadline elapsed. So there was a memo that was issued by the Office of Legal Counsel suggesting that this was not something that could be taken up right now, and that if the ERA's drafters wanted to have the issue be vetted before the Senate, they would actually have to start the ratification process over again. So given the composition of the Senate, I don't think there's going to be a lot of appetite to do that right now. But if things change in November, maybe everything looks different. But I think right now it's unlikely.
I am the world's worst political prognosticator. Just look at my predictions about any recent election, and you'll see that that's true. So I have no comment.
Okay, well, with that in mind, then I'm going to try to get to one more question, if that's okay. Jean Golden is asking, and I'm just going to summarize. She's saying, since we the people govern our democracy, is it not to our interest to get along with the policemen who protect our safety? She says, with that in mind, I find the chant of the protesters of defund the police to be provocative, if not merely castrating. What about using the slogan, connect with the police? Yes, structural changes are imperative, including the support of more social services within the police department, but let's work together in improving the policing of our country and excluding violence.
Well, I have been consistent in my view that the police shouldn't be treated as the enemy here. And if defunding is seen as a means of punishment, then I think it's a mistake. However, there have been experiments. Camden, New Jersey, for example, defunded its police department, I believe around 2012. They laid off every single officer, eliminated the department, built again from scratch. And what's interesting is, although Camden is still a very poor city, the crime has gone down since they recreated their police department on a very different model. And if you want to see the different model, but you can look this up easily. I don't want to take all the time here. Crime has gone down, and also what we can call sharp encounters between police and the police have also gone down. I'm not saying that's a solution everywhere. That wasn't seen as a punishment. It was an act of frustration, but it worked. It worked. And maybe in other places, other solutions will work. The important thing is to keep thinking of ideas and trying them.
So I also think the cry for defund the police is reductive because it's a slogan. I think what they're actually asking for is sort of a reconsideration of a broad range of social services, of which police funding is just one. So the police, for example, in New York City, the funding for the police is about $90 million, and it takes up about 6% of the city's annual budget. So I think part of the call to defund the police is to actually think about deploying those resources to other areas that are necessary. And it also, I think, is a response to qualified immunity, where police officers are not themselves personally liable for misconduct. And in fact, any judgments against them, at least money judgments, are handled by the department and the city. So when they say defund, I think that's part of it as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much for allowing that and a little bit extra time. And I want to take this opportunity, first of all, to thank both of you for making the time, especially during this week when again, we'd actually had you scheduled already, but I think these issues that you discussed coming in the wake of everything that we've experienced as a nation over the last couple of weeks, it was timed well, and we again really appreciate you lending your expertise and your insight to help us all understand these issues better. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I want to thank our members, of course, for being with us today. Another productive discussion. I want to remind you next week on Wednesday, June 17th, we are going to be bringing you 3 experts in the arts world. We're going to be talking about the new era for arts institutions as they deal with so many challenges going on right now, specific to that particular sector. We're going to have Thelma Golden, the Director and Chief Curator of the Studio Museum in Harlem, Julia Levy, who's the Executive Director of the Roundabout Theater Company, and they'll be in conversation with Kate Levin, who's the Principal of Cultural Assets Management of Bloomberg Associates. So it should be a really fascinating conversation and a very current moment of concern for people who are engaged with the arts in our country. So we hope you'll join us next Wednesday for that. In the meantime, don't hesitate to reach out if we can be of service to you. Be healthy, be safe, and thank you again for being a member of the Society of Fellows. Good evening.